In the heart of the night, this world will burn bright. We will set it alight. In the heart of the night, in the heart of the night, this world will burn bright. We will set it alight. In the heart of the night.
Hello everyone, I am Anthropomantic Fiend, and I do horror-related things on the internet. Today I am reviewing another killer gorilla/ape movie from the 30s, 40s area. This time it does not star Bela Lugosi though. This time it is a Boris Karloff movie, and it is called, of all things, The Ape. Very original title. And this one came out 1940. Obviously, it stars Boris Karloff, and he plays Dr. Adrian. And Dr. Adrian is this scientist who has come to this small town to deal with this epidemic of paralysis that happened years and years ago. And at this point, he's treating this girl who has been completely paralyzed from the waist down and is trying to help her to walk again. And in order to do that, he discovers that he needs to use human spinal fluid. And conveniently, at the same time, in this town, an ape or a gorilla, whatever you want to call it, they do use that word interchangeably, escapes from a circus that has just come to town, and it starts killing people. These people get taken to Dr. Adrian, who will use their spinal fluid in order to help further his cure. It works out rather conveniently for him, but not so much for the townsfolk, and they kind of don't like him anyway, so obviously things are gonna get a little bit messy. This movie, as I said, came out 1940. It's definitely a lower budget movie, but I enjoyed it. Obviously, you've got Boris Karloff as Dr. Adrian, and he just seems like the sweetest guy in this movie. Even when you know he's up to some shady mad scientist stuff, he just seems like the sweetest old man throughout the story. On the other hand, you've got these children in this small town who kind of open up the story by going over to his house and throwing rocks and sticks at it, and they are just the most insufferable, obnoxious kids in the world. Well, not the most. I've seen more annoying kids in movies, to be sure, but these guys are not that well acted, and their lines are generic, and they basically are just there to annoy you and to annoy Dr. Adrian, so I didn't like them in the slightest. I think the movie could have worked pretty well if they were not in it. And the rest of the townsfolk really do just feel like stereotypical small town people who are like,
"Yeah, what's this doctor doing here? Experiments? He's weird. Let's get him out of here." And
they don't feel completely like flat characters, but at the same time, they are still fairly flat and not very likable and not very interesting. However, I really did like the girl, I forget her name, who's been partially paralyzed. Her boyfriend I didn't care much for. He was a little bit generic, and their romance was kind of I cared about them and I was happy for them, but at the same time, it was just kind of thin and didn't have much substance to it for the most part. They were both decently acted characters, not very fleshed out, but decently acted, and I did care about them, especially her. Rather than opening with spooky melodramatic music, you get circus music, and it's just very loud and in your face, and I kind of didn't like it. I found it kind of obnoxious. But after the circus music, and they do go to the circus in this movie, so you do get a scene with just some circus music in the background later, which didn't bother me. It really is just sort of background, typical movie mood music, possibly stock music reused from some other movies. Sometimes the soundtracks to these low-budget 30s and 40s horror movies all kind of blend together in my head, and some of it is reused, so hard to say. Music wasn't anything special, though. The story was really good. It was written by I am not sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, so I'll put it down here in case I do, but Kurt Siodmak. I believe he wrote several scripts for Universal, including the script for The Wolfman and for Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, and it's also based on a stage play from around this time. Not unlike The Gorilla, there seem to be not only a lot of gorilla and ape horror movies, but a lot of gorilla and ape sort of murder mystery stage plays around this time. I still haven't looked into why there was this obsession with gorillas and apes at the time, but that's neither here nor there at this point. Because it was written by such a good screenwriter and based on a play, this movie really does have a lot of meat to its plot, and the story really does carry this movie, along with Karloff's performance. It's not like a lot of the other movies I've reviewed on here, where it is really just science gone wrong, monster kills people, and I love sort of these plot-thin, campy B-movies, but this is a B-movie, but it is not got a thin plot. There is a lot of meat to it. The romance was the one aspect that I didn't really care for as much. I didn't hate it. I thought it was okay, but generally just these sort of love interest romance aspects of these older horror movies just don't interest me anyway, so whatever. But it does factor into the plot in some ways, which I liked. Karloff is a very sympathetic character, and I really gravitated towards him. He's got this backstory where he lost his wife and his daughter to this paralyzing disease. The girl who he's treating resembles his daughter in some ways, so he's just sort of will like pretend she's his daughter, and it's not really sort of a creepy obsessive thing like it would be in like a Vincent Price movie where like someone else appears who resembles his dead wife and he's just like goes insane because of it. It's really kind of downplayed in this movie where he just sort of says, you know, will you indulge me a little bit, let me pretend that you're my daughter for just a moment, and she's nice about it, and she's like, yeah, of course. And it's not really a plot point, but because he's lost his wife and his daughter to this disease, he has dedicated the rest of his life to trying to find a cure for this paralysis and help everybody who's suffering from it. That tragic element of his character and just how sweet and devoted he is beautiful, but of course it pushes him to some lengths that end up creating the horror in this movie. The other sort of aspect in that regard of the romance that I liked is that the girl is super sort of ultra conscious of her paralysis at all times, and will sort of reference it a lot. There's a nice scene where she's at the circus and they're watching the trapeze artist, and she's just talking about like, that's what you call sort of muscular coordination and grace or something like that. That's what my doctor calls it. And the boyfriend's always trying to take her mind off of that, and it's like, you know, look over here and at this other thing in this other ring of the circus, but she's sort of fixated on how coordinated and graceful the trapeze artists are. It makes her sort of more conscious of her paralysis for that reason. Because of that, there is this element later on in the movie where it comes into play that even though she's getting cured, it becomes harder for her to walk because she has this sort of mental idea that I'm paralyzed, I can never walk again. So she struggles to move even when she's had these injections that are curing her. Of course, the injections are spinal fluid, and I don't know why it's always spinal fluid in these movies, but it is. In The Ape Man with Lugosi, it was some kind of weird experiment with ape spinal fluid that Lugosi used on himself that started turning him into an ape, which was rather silly. In this movie, it's human spinal fluid, and of course, human spinal fluid has to come from somewhere, so some stuff starts happening regarding that with Karloff, which is, of course, where the horror comes in. The girl, after she starts receiving these injections, she hasn't had any feeling in her legs prior to this. Prior to this, she has not had any feeling in her legs at all, but once she starts getting injections, she does start feeling her legs, and at first they are very weighty, and then she starts actually feeling pain in them. and her boyfriend doesn't really understand this as a good sign that she's actually getting feeling back into her legs and can walk soon. He sort of sees it as the doctor is making her worse. Now she's hurting, and there's this conflict between the doctor and the boyfriend where he is devoted to curing her and in the process finding a cure for other people who are paralyzed. The boyfriend is very possessive of her and is just like, you know what? If it's hurting her, stop doing it. I can take care of her. She can live the rest of her life paralyzed. And he's just like, but think of the rest of the world. And he's like, I'm not in love with the world. I'm in love with her. So he doesn't quite understand. And yes, if this operation is risky and it hurts her, he shouldn't be using her just as a guinea pig to better other people's lives, but he's not. He really does care about her. While there is sort of that possible sort of looking at her as a guinea pig from Karloff, on the guy's end, he doesn't really care if she's wheelchair bound as long as he can be with her, which kind of doesn't take her feelings into account. So there's some messed up stuff with him. I liked that plot point a lot. Again, Karloff just feels so selfless in this movie because of his strange experiments with spinal fluid to try to cure this paralysis. He has been kicked out of whatever scientific foundation he was part of before, and one of the scientists from there comes to visit him, and he shows the guy the process he's made, and he's just like, you know what, we're gonna let you back into the foundation if you want to come with us. And he's like, no, I need to stay here. I have this mission and I'm committed to it. And he just seems like the sweetest person in the world. Of course, there is that obvious dark side. He's still just a very good at heart character despite the horrific lengths he goes to get spinal fluid. Yeah, the story was fantastic. If it's written by Kurt Siodmak, I don't know how many scripts he's written for movies I've seen, but I know he wrote The Wolf Man, and I know he wrote Frankenstein Meets the Wolf Man, and both of those are phenomenal movies. And this was a good movie too. That said, from the visual standpoint, I like the circus and the laboratory, but other than those two sets, everything else is kind of bland, and even those two sets, there's not much there. They're not the most interesting lab or circus, but in general, cinematography, costumes, they all sort of just serve as dressing to sort of tell you where you are and what's happening, and aesthetically there's not much going on that's appealing with this movie. The actual ape slash gorilla, it's just another silly looking gorilla suit. That's kind of the standard for these movies though, so I didn't care. On the whole, there's not really any kind of aesthetic appeal to this movie, and some of the acting is kind of bland, but thanks to Karloff and thanks to the awesome storytelling, I really, really liked this movie, and I think you should check it out. That is my spoiler-free review of The Ape. Here are the spoilers. When the ape first gets out, there's this guy who's been just poking it with a stick, basically, and this guy's like, you know what, you shouldn't do that. And he's just like, I don't care, you know? This ape killed his father, and he's like, yeah, that's because your father was poking it with a stick, so maybe he shouldn't do that. One of these days, the ape's gonna get you, and he's just like, I don't care, I'm gonna keep poking it with a stick, and the guy's like, it's your funeral, and leaves. And as soon as the guy leaves, the ape just strangles him through the bars and then breaks out. Doesn't take abuse from anybody, and it just leaves following that. And the guy was smoking, and his cigarette lands on the ground and catches the hay on the ground on fire. So the circus burns down. Thankfully, the audience is left, but the circus burns down. And I don't know what it is. Why do circuses always burn down in these movies? If there is a circus and it's in a movie, it's gonna catch on fire at some point. It's just a thing. I don't know why, but it is. This guy gets taken to Karloff, and he's not quite dead yet. Rather than healing him, he's just like, I'm going to write you into medical history, and lets him die and takes his spinal fluid. And it works marvelously, and he's got this little bottle of it, and he's talking to his housekeeper, who just kind of is there in the movie. She's actually mute. He's just like, here it is. I've got life in this tiny bottle. And like an idiot, I don't know why you do this if you're a scientist, but plot convenience, he leaves it on the table on its side where it can roll, and it rolls off the table and smashes, and he's just sort of standing there and looking down at it with his housekeeper, and he just goes, just go. That was pretty funny to me, even though it was really sad for him. And then later on, because apparently apes always return to the scene of their crime, he's still got the torn coat of the abusive circus guy in his lab. The ape breaks in through his window later, and Karloff just stabs it with a needle, apparently either stuns or kills it, and evidently kills it because he says to his housekeeper, he's dead, he won't be bothering us anymore, but don't worry. But you start seeing the ape going around and killing more people, and it's just sort of walking around for a stroll in between, upright like a human. I enjoyed the scene where he takes on the ape because as soon as the ape breaks in, he doesn't even like scream or freak out or anything. He just like, it's already smashed a bunch of his stuff, but he just goes for it, and he's kind of a badass there. But following that, you're kind of suspicious. I mean, I kind of didn't suspect anything. I was just like, oh, that's kind of goofy. They have the ape just walking around casually like a person. But then at the very end of the movie, the ape has gone after another person, and you kind of think that the doc just kind of has the ape under his command in some way. But at the very end, the ape gets shot and is on the doorstep of the doctor, and the girl really cares about him, so she's just wheeled herself out there in the chair to help the doctor. But then they go up to the ape and they take off its head, or rather the mask that Dr. Adrian has been wearing, because he's been going around dressed as the ape, killing people in order to obtain their spinal fluid for his experiments. And I had even seen this movie before I watched it again here, even though it's been a couple years now, and I didn't remember that twist. I didn't see it coming. It was in the back of my head, like, are they gonna go that route? Nah. And then they did. And it was awesome, because I didn't expect it. And then the actual end is just so tragic, because the crowd kind of parts, and there's the girl in the wheelchair on one side, and Karloff dying on the front porch on the other, and he's just like, come to me, child, walk to me. And she just stands up and starts walking towards him as he's dying, and she can stand on her legs again, and it's just like, that's good, child, that's very good, and he dies. It was so heartbreaking, and a beautiful tragic ending, and they should have cut the movie there. But they tacked on this little sappy, happy ending at the end where it's just her walking around in the garden with her boyfriend, and she's just like, I've burned my wheelchair, I'm never gonna use it again, and they kiss, and it was just like, you should have left it on the dark, tragic ending. That was better. Nonetheless, this movie was really good. I didn't remember it being this good from the first time I saw it. My expectations were kind of low for it, despite Karloff and Siodmak being on board, and it very much exceeded those expectations. Visually, there's nothing going on with this movie, but story-wise, there's a lot going on, and I thought it was fantastic. So, once again, I highly recommend you check out The Ape. Thank you for watching my video, and hopefully I will see you in another one. Bye!